For a long time, I believed happiness was something I had to add to my life. More success, more money, more experiences, more progress. I thought that once I reached a certain point, something inside me would finally unlock. Calm, satisfaction, relief. But that moment never came. Every new goal only created another one. Every achievement felt smaller than I expected. And instead of feeling fulfilled, I felt tired, distracted, like I was constantly running but never arriving anywhere. What I didn't understand back then was simple, but I'm comfortable to accept. My happiness wasn't blocked by what I lacked. It was being quietly drained by behaviors I repeated every single day without noticing. They didn't look dramatic. They didn't feel dangerous. They were socially accepted, sometimes even praised. And that's exactly why they were so effective. These behaviors didn't destroy my happiness overnight. They eroded it slowly. They consumed energy, clarity, and peace in small, almost invisible ways. I woke up tired. My mind felt noisy. Even during moments that should have felt good, part of me was elsewhere. Thinking, comparing, worrying, judging. I assumed this was just adult life. Stress, responsibility, normal pressure. But normal doesn't mean healthy, and common doesn't mean harmless. In this video, I want to walk you through 11 silent behaviors that kept me stuck for years. Not from the perspective of a guru or a psychologist, but as someone who lived inside them without realizing it. Recognizing them was the first real turning point. Not because awareness magically fixes everything, but because you can't change what you don't see. The first behavior was perfectionism. Not the healthy kind that pushes you to do things well, but the version that paralyzes you. I delayed starting projects because they didn't feel ready. I rewrote messages endlessly, afraid of saying the wrong thing. I confused high standards with fear of judgment. Perfectionism disguised itself as responsibility, but it was actually avoidance. It kept me stuck, constantly feeling inadequate because the bar was always unreachable. The second behavior was people-pleasing. Saying yes when I wanted to say no. Filling my schedule to avoid disappointing others. Measuring my value through approval. Every yes cost me energy, time, and rest. And the resentment quietly built up. I wasn't being kind. I was being afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of being seen as selfish. Over time, this taught me that my needs mattered less than everyone else's, and that belief slowly hollowed me out. The third behavior was living anywhere except the present. My mind was either replaying past mistakes or rehearsing future disasters. The present moment barely existed, and happiness cannot survive in a place you never inhabit. The past can't be changed. The future can't be controlled. Yet I spent most of my mental energy there, neglecting the only moment where life actually happens. These behaviors felt normal. That was the problem. They blended into my identity so well that I mistook them for personality traits. But they weren't who I was. They were habits, and habits can change. One of the most dangerous things about these behaviors is how convincing they are. They sound reasonable. They feel justified. And because they're internal, no one else sees the damage they cause. Rumination was one of them. Constantly replaying conversations, imagining better responses, fixating on things I couldn't undo. I told myself I was reflecting, but I wasn't learning anything new. I was just reopening the same mental wounds. Rumination doesn't solve problems. It rehearses pain, and it keeps your nervous system in a permanent state of alert. Another silent behavior was the need to always be right. In discussions, my goal wasn't understanding, it was winning. I listened to respond, not to comprehend. Every disagreement felt like a threat to my identity. This turned conversations into battles and slowly poisoned relationships. The cost wasn't just tension with others, it was rigidity. When being right becomes more important than being connected, you stop growing, you stop learning, you stop listening. Judgment followed closely behind. I judged myself harshly for every mistake, and I judged others just as quickly. Judgment creates distance from yourself, from people, from reality. It simplifies complex situations into good and bad, right and wrong. And while that may feel clarifying, it strips life of depth and compassion. Chronic self-criticism destroyed my confidence. Constantly judging others isolated me emotionally. Both came from the same place: insecurity. Another behavior was postponing happiness, telling myself, I'll relax when this is done, or I'll enjoy life once I reach that point. Happiness was always scheduled for later, but later never arrives the way you expect. Life becomes a waiting room, and you spend years preparing to live instead of actually living. This mindset creates a moving finish line. You reach one goal, feel a brief sense of relief, then immediately raise the bar. The satisfaction never lasts because it was never rooted in the present. What helped wasn't positive thinking or forcing gratitude. It was learning to notice. Noticing when my mind drifted, noticing when I was judging, noticing when I was trying to win instead of understand. Presence doesn't require hours of meditation. It starts with simple attention. Eating without distraction, walking without headphones, listening without planning a response. These moments seem insignificant, but they retrain your mind to stay where your life actually is. Mental noise doesn't disappear instantly, but once you stop feeding it, it loses its power. Some of the most damaging behaviors aren't dramatic or emotional. They're practical, efficient, normal. They hide inside routines that look productive on the surface, but slowly drain your energy underneath. Social comparison was one of the first I had to confront. Not the obvious kind where you openly envy someone, but the constant low-level exposure to other people's curated lives. I wasn't consciously comparing myself every time I scrolled, but my brain was keeping score anyway. Who was ahead? Who was doing better? Who had already figured things out? Even when I knew those images were filtered and selective, the emotional impact still landed. Over time, it created a quiet dissatisfaction. Progress felt invisible. Achievements felt smaller. No matter what I did, there was always someone who appeared to be further along. This didn't motivate me. It exhausted me. The problem wasn't ambition. It was the reference point. I was measuring my life against a distorted standard. The shift happened when I reduced exposure and changed how I interpreted what I saw. Instead of asking, why am I not there yet? I started asking, what does this tell me about what I want? Comparison stopped being a verdict and became information. That single change softened its grip. Another habit that drained me daily was multitasking. I treated divided attention as a skill. Emails during meetings, messages while working, background content at all times. It felt efficient, but the cost was subtle and cumulative. My focus became shallow. I finished days mentally exhausted without feeling accomplished. Science confirms what experience eventually taught me. The brain doesn't multitask, it switches, and every switch consumes energy. Over time, this leads to mental fatigue, increased stress, and a constant sense of urgency without clarity. I replaced multitasking with intentional focus, one task at a time, notifications off, phone in another room, conversations without interruption. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost boring, but that discomfort was withdrawal from constant stimulation. What followed was depth, flow, a sense of completion I hadn't felt in years. Complaining was another behavior I underestimated. It felt like bonding, like harmless venting. But complaining trains attention toward problems. It reinforces helplessness. It strengthens neural pathways associated with negativity. I noticed that the more I complained, the more there was to complain about. It became a reflex. I interrupted that loop by pausing before voicing frustration, asking myself simple questions. Can I act on this? Can I accept it? Can I drop it? This didn't make problems disappear, but it restored a sense of agency. Instead of rehearsing irritation, I started choosing responses. Clutter was another silent drain, not just physical clutter, but mental clutter. Unfinished tasks, lingering worries, open loops constantly running in the background. A chaotic environment kept my nervous system slightly activated all the time. Decluttering wasn't about aesthetics. It was about reducing cognitive load. I simplified my surroundings and externalized my thoughts, writing things down, closing loops, letting go of what no longer served a purpose. With fewer signals competing for attention, my mind finally had space to rest. None of these habits screamed, problem. That's why they were effective at stealing happiness. They felt normal, responsible, modern. But together, they kept me in a state of low-grade depletion. Removing them didn't make life perfect. It made it lighter. The final behaviors were the hardest to admit, because they were the most normalized. Neglecting my body didn't feel like self-sabotage. It felt practical. Sleep became optional. Meals were rushed or improvised. Movement was postponed. I told myself I'd take care of it later, but later never came, and the consequences showed up quietly. Lower energy, shorter patience, reduced motivation. The mistake was treating the mind and body as separate systems. They aren't. Mental clarity depends on physical stability. Lack of sleep disrupts emotional regulation. Poor nutrition affects focus and mood. Inactivity limits the release of chemicals that naturally stabilize mental health. I didn't overhaul my lifestyle. I adjusted it. Earlier nights, daily walks, better hydration, small, repeatable changes that restored baseline energy. The impact was disproportionate. Another behavior was equating worth with productivity. If I wasn't busy, I felt uneasy. Rest felt undeserved. Stillness felt unproductive. This mindset turned life into an endless performance. I was always preparing for the next task, the next goal, the next obligation. Joy became conditional, only allowed after achievement. This kept me in a constant state of postponement. I learned that rest isn't a reward, it's maintenance. Without it, everything degrades. Relationships, focus, health. Allowing rest without justification restored balance. It didn't make me less driven, it made my effort sustainable. One of the most subtle shifts was learning to stop measuring my life by outcomes alone. Promotions, milestones, future plans. I had trained myself to believe happiness lived somewhere ahead. Once this happens, once I get there, once things settle. But that mindset turns the present into a waiting room. Life becomes preparation instead of participation. Even when goals are achieved, the satisfaction is brief because the habit of postponement remains. I replaced that with deliberate presence, not forced gratitude, not positivity, simply noticing what's already here. Small moments, ordinary comforts, neutral days without crisis. This rewired my attention toward stability instead of anticipation. The final realization was this: happiness isn't something you acquire, it's something you stop interfering with. By removing behaviors that quietly drain energy, attention, and self-respect, by choosing consistency over intensity, awareness over judgment, simplicity over excess. This process didn't make me euphoric, it made me steady, calm, capable. And that stability created space for genuine satisfaction to emerge naturally. If you take one thing from this, let it be this: don't try to change everything. Choose one behavior, the one that felt uncomfortably familiar. Work on it consistently. Research suggests it takes about 66 days to form a stable habit. That's manageable. Change doesn't come from motivation spikes, it comes from repetition. Happiness isn't a destination waiting in the future, It's the result of no longer working against yourself day after day. If you're still here, thank you. That means you stayed past the easy parts. There's one last habit I want to share with you. It's not obvious, it's rarely discussed, and it doesn't look unhealthy at all, but it quietly shapes how you feel every day. The habit is never being alone with your own thoughts. For a long time, I filled every empty moment with something. A video while getting ready, a podcast while commuting, music while cooking, scrolling while eating, something playing in the background before sleep. There was always noise, always input. It felt normal, even productive. I told myself I was learning, staying informed, using my time well. And sometimes that was true, but the pattern underneath was different. Silence made me uncomfortable. Stillness felt wrong. If nothing was happening, I reached for something without thinking. Not because I needed information, but because I didn't want to be alone with my mind. Over time, this became automatic. Waiting in line, phone out. Short walk, earbuds in. A quiet evening, something playing. My brain never had a break, and that had consequences I didn't notice right away. When there's always external input, your internal signal gets weaker. You stop checking in with yourself. You don't notice what you actually feel. You don't hear when something in your life isn't working. You stay distracted enough to function, but not present enough to adjust. The problem isn't content. The problem is replacement. Content starts replacing reflection, replacing boredom, replacing the moments where your mind would normally process emotions, connect dots, or surface uncomfortable truths. Those moments are important. They're where clarity comes from. When you remove them, life keeps moving, but you're no longer steering. Another effect of constant input is borrowed priorities. You hear so many opinions, goals, fears, and urgencies that they start blending into your own thinking. You begin chasing things without knowing why. You feel busy, but not aligned, informed, but unsure, motivated, but restless. Happiness requires alignment, not excitement, not stimulation. Alignment. And you can't align with yourself if you never slow down long enough to hear what you actually think and want. I started noticing this habit in small ways. I couldn't sit still without reaching for something. Silence felt empty instead of restful. That was the signal. So I made a simple change. I didn't delete everything. I didn't isolate myself. I just created short spaces with no input. Walking without headphones, sitting without a screen, letting my mind wander for a few minutes. At first, it was uncomfortable. My thoughts were messy, sometimes boring, sometimes annoying. But that discomfort passed, and what replaced it was clarity. I started noticing patterns, what drained me, what I was avoiding, what I kept postponing. Without noise, my mind started finishing thoughts instead of constantly starting new ones. This habit quietly steals happiness because it keeps you disconnected from yourself. Not dramatically, not painfully, just enough that life feels slightly off. You're not miserable. You're just never fully settled. And that's dangerous because it feels normal. Breaking this habit doesn't require discipline or willpower. It requires permission. Permission to be bored. Permission to be quiet. Permission to exist without consuming something. When you allow that regularly, your internal voice gets stronger. Decisions feel clearer. Emotions make more sense. You stop outsourcing your inner life to endless input. That's not philosophy. That's basic mental hygiene. You don't need to fix everything. You shouldn't try to. Choose one habit from this video, the one that felt uncomfortable to hear, the one you recognized immediately. Work on that one, slowly, consistently. If you want, leave a comment and say which habit you saw in yourself. No explanations needed, just the name. And if this kind of calm, honest breakdown helps you think more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. More videos like this are coming. Cheers.